The current business committee or the ancestors of the current business committee were elected in about 1936 because the Indian Reorganization Act was passed, I believe, in 1934. That is one of those acronyms, one of those organizations that was begun under Franklin D Roosevelt. He was elected in 1932, and there was a big effort to stabilize the Indian tribes because they were in desperate need of stabilization because they were at the lowest population at that time. Well, the lowest population was actually in 1890 when there was only 258,000 Indians registered in the whole United States, after there had been millions here at the time of colonization. So that Franklin D. Roosevelt's organization, or his administration, under John Collier, I believe John Collier was his Secretary of Interior, began a whole effort to reorganize the tribes under a constitution that was similar to the United States Constitution. So many of the tribes adopted that IRA constitution, but many of them did not. So the Oneida Tribe of Indians of Wisconsin was one of those tribes that adopted that constitution, the format for that constitution, and they developed a constitution whereby there would be a general tribal council that was the governing body of the tribe, not the officers, but the entire general tribal council. So that's a pure democratic organization, and that's what we have today.
Why was the business committee created in place of the traditional government, especially if we condoled the chiefs in 1925?
Well, I think that the traditional government of having chiefs, 3 major chiefs for the clans, the wolf, the bear, and the turtle, and then 3 and also some sub-chiefs under each one of those, that was really dissipated before 1900. It was gone. But there were other establishments that took its place, and so there were, well, for instance, at the time of the distribution of lands by allotment in 1891, there were 14 chiefs. Well, Oneida didn't have 14 chiefs. They had 9 chiefs, traditionally. So they had 14 chiefs. There were 8 that were associated with the Episcopal Church and 6 that were associated with the Methodist Church. So they were not only religious, but they were political at the same time. So those 2 separate bodies of chiefs usually opposed one another. So one group of them was in favor of allotment in 1891, or before that, because they started the allotment process in 1870. So there were 6 of them who were in favor of allotment and 8 of them who were opposed. So that's what happened there. And I think the Oneida tribe was in the state of flux organizationally for about 100 years.
Okay. So now that the Constitution is passed, the membership, the Oneida membership, agreed to create the business committee, when was the election?
Set up underneath the Indian Reorganization Act, the election was every year. That's very difficult because you just get settled and you just start programs or start efforts with your tribal members, and it's time to start another election again. So it was every year up until about 1968 or 69. I think it may have been 69, when there was a special secretarial election. That's the Secretary of Interior. Secretary election, and the ballots were sent out, absentee ballots, to every single voting member of the Oneida tribe. And so when the election was complete, that special election, it changed from 4 executive committee members. Those were the chair, vice chair, secretary, and treasurer. And I was a secretary under that organization structure in 1967. And the next year, they were expanded from 4 executive committee members to 9 business committee members, with 4 officers and the 5 councilmen. And so it was expanded to the 9 members for the business committee. And then it was also changed from a 1-year election to a every 3-year election. But the difficulty with that is that all 9 business committee members would be elected at the same time every 3 years. There were no staggered terms. So it could be possible for the entire 9 members to be turned over in a 3-year election.
So to clarify, when the business committee started, there were just 4 officers that were elected.
That is correct.
Okay. What kind of duties and responsibilities did they have at the startup of the business committee?
Well, the duties and responsibilities are in the bylaws, and they're quite clear. They're very succinct, but they're very clear. For instance, the treasurer had the longest list of duties, and that was to take care of the resources of the tribe, and that would be to collect and to distribute and to put in safekeeping the funds of the tribe. Those were spelled out for the treasurer, and of course the secretary had the duty of the record keeping, the minutes, and processing the minutes. The problem was, at that time in 1967 when I was elected, is that we had no typewriter, we had no filing cabinet, we did not have a place to meet, we had no resources at all. So we met in the Holy Apostles Church basement. We met in the parish hall. We met wherever there was a space open at the time. Or we met at the, it was over in Site 2, in the White Building.
Chicago Corners?
Yeah, at Chicago Corners. We met there, and there was no heat, so we were all bundled up and wearing gloves or mittens in order to write. It was very cold. So those are the constraints that we had at the time. Very, very poor, no income.
And that's when you were elected?
That is when I was elected.
So you mentioned of where the meeting locations were when you were elected. When the business committee started, where would they meet?
Well, in 1970, I believe it was, that Austin Straubel Airport wanted to expand the runway, and there was a parcel of land at the end of the runway, 10 acres, that they wanted, and they were unable to condemn it because you could not condemn trust land that was in trust. So between the Bureau and the tribe and Austin Straubel, they worked out an agreement whereby another piece of land with a house on it, because Lester Skindor and his wife were living in the house on that property, would have a house and would have equivalent value, and then we could transfer that 10 acres to the county so it could be part of the Austin airport, Austin Straubel Airport. And we got some income from that, and we used that money to purchase the former Chicago Corners school, public school. And so that's where the business committee and the tribal council met after that time. And the chairman, Purcell Paulus, had his office in that building.
Were the early startup officers full-time positions?
A couple of the officers were. I think the chair and the secretary was either, at that time, was Amelia Cornelius, and I think at one time we had another lady may have been in there. But they weren't paid from tribal funds. We had a grant for developers, or a developing crew for 4 positions. And Purcell, I believe Purcell and Amelia were paid from that grant, and they could be on duty full-time, but their main duties were to work in the project, not on governmental stuff. But they fulfilled those 2 positions.
And that's, you're referring to about the 1970?
1970. Mm-hmm.
What about the positions before that? From the startup with the first election of the business committee? Were they part-time or full-time?
They were not paid at all. I think we had 7 cents a mile to get to the meeting. There was no payment for participating in the meetings, and we started the meetings were scheduled at 7 o'clock in the evening because everybody that was on the business committee or were officers, they had jobs in other places. So they had to go to their job and come home and eat dinner and then have a meeting. And so we started the meetings at 7 o'clock. And one particular time, I remember being at the meeting, ending the meeting at 3 o'clock in the morning. I was very tired. I fell asleep and almost put my head on the table because it was too tiresome. And other people had to do that too, and they had to go to work the next day as I did. Mm-hmm. So that's how we operated those first years until, and we were funded on programs under Great Lakes Intertribal Council. That's when they started, because that was called the CAP programs, Community Action Programs, or there were the other things that began at that time. There was the Head Start program, the community health representatives, as I said, the CAP program, Community Action Program, emergency food and emergency employment, something called JTPA, Jobs Training Partnership Act. All of those were coming in the late 60s or early 70s. And those were grant programs from the federal government, basically, that were funneled through Great Lakes Intertribal Council and from Great Lakes Intertribal to the individual tribes in Wisconsin. So Oneida got an equal portion to all the other tribes. Whereas we had the major population, and some of the other tribes had hundreds of people, not thousands, and we had thousands, but we got the same amount of funding as they did. So somewhere in the late 70s, I think our chairman took action to take our portion from the Great Lakes funding based on our population. And that was a more fair distribution. And then we finally got some additional funding for the amount of population that we had.
Okay. From the first election for the business committee up until you were elected, what were the primary big jobs that they took care of, or what were they looking after?
I believe that most of that was, most of what they did between 1936 and when they started to get funding from the federal government was volunteer. I don't believe there were any positions except if they were funded by some outside organization. Like I believe Morris Wheelock was funded through a veterans organization. So he did things for Oneida veterans, but not because he was funded by Oneida or by a program through Oneida, but because he was funded from a veterans organization out from the exterior. And that's how most everything was handled. It was Depression times. And in Depression, nobody had any funding. And the only funding coming in was during those Roosevelt years, when they started in 33, 34, and that time. Then there started to be some funding in order to be operational. Otherwise, tribal members were living on their little pieces of land and raising an acre of beans or cucumbers and picking beans and cucumbers, or picking fruits and vegetables for the cherry orchards up north in Sturgeon Bay, or picking corn for canning companies, or working in fields somewhere. That's the only income they had.
Current times, the business committee meets every other Wednesday. When it first started up, did they invite the community members to attend their meetings?
They often did. And they did have some celebrations, like a picnic. They sponsored picnics at Holy Apostles Church, or over at Site 2. They'd have something, and a lot of people would turn out, and they would drive, because from Menasha and Milwaukee and Appleton, places where they were living, for these occasions. 4th of July was a big celebration. And so all the Oneidas that were within vicinity somewhere, they would come home. So they did sponsor those things, and there was even lacrosse played here during those times. There were other people from other reservations, the whole chunk in the Menominee. Menominee had a band. They would bring their band. And that happened prior to the Indian Reorganization Act.
Okay. So now we're up to the point where you're elected, and you ran for the business committee. Why did you run for the business committee?
Well, that's an interesting story because Norwood Hill and Oscar were officers, previous officers, and I joined the Air Force in 51, and I came home in 66. And Oscar and Norbert came to my house in the summer of 67. They came once and they asked me if I would run for secretary, and I told them no. I had 7 children at home. Some of them were very young, 2 years old and 4 years old were the youngest. And I didn't have any running water in my house. I had to wash out of doors, and I had to do all these things in order to keep my family going. And I told them no, I couldn't handle it. And they came back 2 more times, coming through the woods and coming down the dirt driveway. And they insisted I run, and I said, you can put my name on the ballot, and if I win, I'll do the best I can. They put my name on the ballot, and I won. And so I've been involved in tribal politics ever since June of 1967 because of that.
So what office, business committee positions have you held?
All of them, except chair. I have been a secretary several times, and vice chair. I was vice chair, and I was a treasurer in 1991 when the new casino was built. So I was the first treasurer with the income that we have today. Not as much, but the beginning of that income.
When was your last day on the business committee?
Probably in August of 1996. Because I was not, I ran for chair and I was not elected for that position. So then I had an invitation to go to South Africa in September of 96, and I went to South Africa. And for 2 weeks to talk about economic development ventures with the United Nations. Unfortunately, our officers and our people did not look at the business plans that I brought back from that venture. I brought back five business plans from the black folks that were the natives there from the different provinces. And it was, I still have those plans. They were very lucrative proposals. They were done by professional people, teachers and people that had master's and doctor's degrees. But unfortunately, our own folks did not realize the value of that venture.
When you were first elected onto the business committee, what did you want to get accomplished?
Well, I just wanted to do the minutes. I had to write it. I had to write the minutes out. There was no, and it was difficult for the people who came after to sort them out and file them, because they were written notes in a cardboard box. You know, difficult. No organization, no really no resources to do the job correctly. So what I wanted to do was, well, just like anybody else would be, to improve the lives of tribal members, make sure everybody had enough food, make sure that everybody had decent housing, those kinds of things, work on those kinds of projects. Health was a major concern, because everybody that lived in Oneida had to go to Green Bay or Seymour to some doctor, because that's the best they could do. And we had a doctor in Seymour. I will name him. His name was Dr. Hittner. And no one knew that the United States government gave him a contract to take care of the health of the Oneidas. The Oneidas didn't know it, but they go to him and they might get treated, and they might get a placebo. A placebo is just a sugar pill, and they'd be happy. They'd go home. The doctor treated them. The doctor was getting very good money to treat them correctly. And nobody knew it until long after that he had been getting a contract from the United States government for quite some time to treat Oneida people.
With the change in increase in business committee members from 4 to 9, was there a lot of dissension and unorganization?
I think there was good times and some not so good times. I think the not so good times were people who had, just as today, and I'll include this in the commentary, is that they had their own agendas and not a tribal agenda. And I think that's kind of what's lacking today, is that if you had 9 people on the business committee with the similar agendas or complementary agendas that would help one another, that we would not use so much energy in non-productive efforts. And I think we do use I think we burn an awful lot of energy in non-productive efforts, because we're not looking at the total tribe, we're looking at individual little pockets of concern here and there. And some of it is not so much concern as it is looking at who's got more and who's got less, and who's in those kind of things, rather than, we talk about Neopolihoda, and that's not, in my opinion, that's not what we are doing now.
So thinking back when you were on the business committee, you said that the budget was minimal. When was there a budget to provide for full-time employment of the business committee?
I believe in 1977 we were paying 7 people, or maybe all the business committee at that time, but we had to lay off everybody because we didn't have enough money, except the officers. And that was in 1977. And until we started generating some of our own money, we were dependent on grants specifically. There were federal grants and state grants. And so from year to year, you were not sure if you would have employment the next year, because you had to wait for the grant to be written and approved and go through the process before it would be implemented. And that took, it always took time. You always backlogged, or things did not happen on the date that they were supposed to occur. So sometimes, right now, I think our federal government is shut down for a certain period of time until something happens, a new wall gets built down in Mexico or something. And we had to wait for certain things to happen also before our funds came through. And they had to be approved. You wrote quarterly reports, and the quarterly reports had to be approved. You had to turn them in on time, and then they had to be approved before you get funding for the next quarter or the next half a year. And that happened all the time.
Okay. The business committee was created to represent the people. So when would the business committee, even in the early days, early election and the creation of the business committee, when would they hold general tribal council meetings?
I know we had, the first one I remember was in July of 1968, and it was held in the parish hall. Of course, you could call a general tribal council whenever you thought you needed one, but you had to give the appropriate a number of days notice, that kind of thing. But we had one at least once a year, a general tribal council meeting. But on the other meetings, when it was just the officers, the general tribal council was welcomed, and they participated whenever they thought they needed to. If somebody was looking for water for their home, or looking for a home, or that kind of thing, they would be sure to be at the meeting. Those things were discussed then. So that happened. But the General Tribal Council usually, when there was one of those meetings, that the superintendent from the agency at Ashland and his entourage, I don't know how many people he brought along, would come to the meetings, and then the Oneidas would be sure to be there because they wanted to talk to the superintendent, or they wanted to talk to the officers. So they thought they could get their roof fixed. Melissa was always wanting to get her roof fixed. And she'd come to the General Tribal Council meeting to see Mr. Riley, Mr. Emmett J. Riley, and she'd say, she couldn't see, but she'd say, "Oh, is that Mr. Riley over there? I want to see Mr. Riley." Well, she knew it was Mr. Riley. She thought, she made believe she couldn't see, but she could see just as well. And she wanted to get her roof fixed. We got a picture of her house. Her house never got her roof fixed. So it caved in eventually.
With the election of officers year after year, the terms were one year. Who was the longest chairperson that we've ever elected?
Percy. He was elected in 1967, and he was on for over 20 years. there was a break in there because it was a removal. There was an election, and that person got 1 or 2 more votes than Percy. I think it was a 3-way split. I ran for chair that year, and we all had the same number of votes within 1 or 2 votes of each other. And I think Norrie Damrow stood up, and they had a special meeting, and Norrie Damrow stood up and said she moved that the election, the way it came out, would move ahead. And I think Gary Metoxen had a vote or 2 more than Percy and I, and so that fixed that. Then Gary Metoxen was the chair, and that was the only time for within 1 or 2 years that Percy was not on as chair.
Was there ever, well, I don't want to ask that yet. When was the first female chairperson?
That was Irene Moore was elected, like I said, 2 terms before I was on. I was on in 67, so she probably was on in 65. And she was only on for 1 year, and then she was voted out. And there was only like a couple hundred people who voted, and I believe Norbert Hill was opposing her in the next election in 68. Or, no, that's not right, 66, because I was in 67.
How many female chairpersons have Oneida had?
Well, let me see now. There's Tina Danforth, and Debbie Dockstader Thundercloud, and Irene, and I think that's it. Irene Moore. Mm-hmm.
Have Oneida women always participated in elections and been elected?
Well, no. I think there were, up until Irene ran, I think there were always, it was like mostly men. Probably all men, up until Irene decided to run at that time. Women were vocal, but they weren't elected. I think you can say that, because a lot of times women had to be vocal and they had to run things, because at the time men were working someplace. Men would be living here, but they would work in Manitowoc, they would work in Neenah, they would work in Appleton and other places. And who was home? The women with the children. So the women with the children had to be vocal, and they had to run things that were home. And that reminds me of going back to the Civil War, when 10% of our population went to the Civil War, and the people who ran the farms were the women at home. And they had, and at the same time they had a smallpox epidemic here, and they had to raise their families and raise their crops and do all that stuff at home, and so they had to run things. So, and that was in the 1860s.
With all of the years with the election of the business committee members, have there been removals?
Have there been what?
Removals. Removal from office.
Just the one time that I know of, and that was in the 80s. in the early 80s when there was a removal of the general manager. They said illegally. That was a charge. It was an illegal removal of the general manager. His name was, he was a Seneca Indian from New York, and I can't think of his name. I want to say Villa something. Anyway, he was told to fire somebody, and he said he had all the documentation that he could not fire that person because there was no reason to do so. So the business committee voted, 5 of them voted to remove him then, because he was instructed to remove the person, and he said he couldn't remove the person because it would be an illegal action. So 5 people voted to remove him, and then the General Tribal got up in arms and they said, well, we're going to charge the business committee members who voted to remove him because that was not legal. They could not do that the way they did it. And so there were hearings. There must have been 10 or 15 hearings in the auditorium at the Norbert Health Center. I was the parliamentarian for every one of those meetings. And the auditorium, there are over 400 seats there, and everyone was always filled for every hearing. And I was a parliamentarian, and they removed 4 of those business committee members and kept one on. The one they kept on was Lloyd Powless. And I think the 4 that they removed were Frank Cornelius, Wendell McLester, Howard Cannon, and I don't know if I can remember the other one.
Gary Metoxa?
Hmm?
Gary Metoxa?
Oh, and Gary. Yeah, Gary was the chair at the time. So those 4 people. But I don't know why they could remove Gary, because he was the chair and he wouldn't have a vote. Unless he voted to break the tie on it. And I don't remember that vote. But yeah, those were the 4 who were removed. And they were removed for, that would have been the rest of their term. So that had been about 1.5 years they would have been off before they would have been off. But they had another special election after their removal. And I was back on in that special election.
With the creation of the business committee, and we talked a little bit about the traditional government with the chiefs. Has the business committee and traditional government ever discussed anything?
I don't think there was a traditional government at that time, but around 1900, there was a way of, they didn't call their leaders chiefs, they called them sachems at that time. So I think they were having a very hard time to get everything in balance during the late 1800s and the early 1900s, because they were not a traditional government as in the Great Law in the Gully Rio. They were not a traditional government in that sense, but they had chiefs, and they were recognizing clan mothers, because I see the reference to clan mothers from time to time. But I think they were not like an old, formal, great law government. I don't think they were anymore, because it was too broken up by the influence of the churches. And there were more than one church. That were the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Episcopalians, and the Catholics were all trying to proselytize the Oneidas, and so everyone was they were going in all different directions. And so I thought the poor Oneidas didn't know which way to go, because they didn't know which one to follow. They didn't know if their soul was going to be saved or not, and that was their main concern. It wasn't whether or not they were going to, who was going to be the chief, and it was whether or not they were going to save their soul. And I think that was very, very destructive to the whole organization of the tribe. And it's a wonder we recovered it all. That's what I think. I think we are lucky. We got as much togetherness as we have because of what was done to the tribal members. And part of that was the operation of the Christian churches in the Oneida community.
Just thinking about a couple budgets, you said the early BC kind of volunteered, work for the community. Then when you started on the business committee, there were grants that were applied for and obtained. When you left the business committee, what kind of budget did the business committee have?
Well, that was in 1996, so the casino was in full operation at that time. So there were multi-millions, I don't know, probably 250 million, something like that. And I think to this day we don't know what to do with it. I mean, we just passed, the General Tribal Council just passed a resolution for the budget. And I think they did a pretty good thing, but I would bet that 17,000 people who are members of this tribe do not know anything about the budget. They do not. Because it's too convoluted. It's too, I wouldn't know of a person who could, if you opened up the budget and looked at it and said, explain that, I don't think anybody could. Except maybe the people who are working on the budget, up in accounting or in the chief financial officer's quarters. They could explain it maybe, but not, few other people could.
So the time that you were on the business committee, what kind of programs were created?
Well, there's almost everything that we have today. For instance, the development of the elementary school, for instance. That's one, at Turtle School. And then the high school was added to that. The higher education program, the funding of the higher education program, that's a major output of resources. But I think it's a major input too, but if we don't have enough people who get the funding for their degrees that come back to help the tribe. Reciprocity. There's no reciprocity in that higher education program. Not much that I can, a few people will find their way back home, but most of them, there are doctors and other professionals that are out there in Nevada and California and all over that are funded by the Oneida Nation, but they're not they're not contributing back to the tribe. Occasionally you'll have one or two persons that actually are very thankful for their funding, and they will contribute something. There was one lady that I heard of that contributed millions, or a million something, to the Holy Apostles Church. And there, once in a while you'll have somebody that'll come back and give something to the tribe, but it's very, very seldom. They get all the money and they do what they're doing and they have a good life and they don't contribute.
So with the business committee dealing with state, local, and federal agencies, what kind of relationship did the business committee have with local municipalities? Green Bay, Ashwaubenon, Hobart, Town of Oneida.
Actually, they were pretty good. It's always, the relationship with the town of Oneida has always been good, as far as I can see. That was good. I think this ruckus, if we can call it that, with the town of Hobart is a recent thing. And just since Rich Heidel became the chair over there. And they have a different mentality on dealing with their tribal relationships, their tribal people. We still do not have enough education out into, say, out into Green Bay. I don't think we have enough education with the Packers. The Packers are a big deal. And we've got everything Packer in our casino, and I don't like it. I don't like it because I think the Packers should be contributing to us, and we should not be contributing to them and paying for a big gate out there. Our people who are in promotions and that kind of thing are saying, well, that's doing us a lot of good. I'm not convinced of that.
With all of your experiences on the business committee, what do you think of the current business committee? How are they doing? Do you like what they're accomplishing for the community?
Well, I think our present committee has their mind going in the right direction. Well, let's say it the other way. I think their heart is going in the right direction, but their mind has not caught up with it. Because they're young, and that's no crime. It's good. I mean, you're young and energetic. That's good. But they have to walk the talk. And the talk is always the core values and the genealogy, and we take care of our young people, our newly born, and we take care of our elders. That's not so. It's not really so. It's talked about, but it's not in effect very much. And I think they might be too wound up in their day-to-day agendas. If you go through the hall and see their agendas up there, 9 o'clock this, 10 o'clock that, right down the line. And where is the time for the open door policy and the people? I don't see that. I always have an open door. You know that because you see people in my office a lot. Because they walk right in and they, yeah, come on in. We don't have an open door policy. We are too wrapped up in I said, you know what? This tribe has got more SOPs than the United States Air Force, where I was. I never had to jump like this with everybody and everything. And I don't yet, no matter what they do. So I think we have to unlearn some of that stuff and pay attention to who we are and where we came from and how tough it was to get here. And we're not doing that. We're like everything is handed to us and we want more. And it's not, the older folks know, but even they are spoiled, I have to admit. Because I see them, you know, they got everything in their house and it's a new house and everything, and yet they want demand. I want you here right now and fix my toilet or fix something or clean my house for me or something. That is, in my estimation, that's not Oneida. That's not the way. We should be turning around and seeing who needs help and seeing, and these things come back to you. If you do good deeds for people, they come back to you. I mean, you don't have to look for them or anything. There's just people will take care of you. So I think our young business committee needs, I don't know how to explain it. They need something. They need a vision, probably. We got visions and all that. I don't think we pay any attention to those either, the ones that are written down. But I think they need a vision of what this community should really be when they walk out of the door today in their house or everything. What is it that's going to be better and pleasing and helpful, not only to them but to everybody in the community? That's what I think about it. Young is not wrong. It's just that you need to learn more. And if they studied a little bit, you know, how many hundreds of books do I have that, and I read from them every day. I learn something every day from my books and from my papers. Every day is a good day because I can read some more stuff and catch up with what I didn't know. When I read that Redcliffe thing today, I was amazed. I was just absolutely amazed. It says, well, who cares about Redcliffe? They're not ours. We're not them. And oh, but we are. Mm-hmm. So I think we've got an awful long way to go to be exemplary leadership in the Indian world. Not only Oneida world, but the Indian world. I think that we could teach Donald Trump something if we cared to. We could.
Is there anything else that you would like to add that wasn't
That I would like to add?
Or what your experiences are from the business committee?
Well, the one thing I'd like to add is that I'd like to thank all the people in Oneida for what they've given me. And people give me something every day. And just for your information, yesterday a woman said, you know what, I read your article in the Gully Results, and she said, I cried. And that's what's going on right now. And there are hundreds of people that are sympathetic and that said we are doing the incorrect thing. And I'm not going to be up there and shouting and being over articulate or anything about it. I'm going to say the community will speak in the end.
Well, with that being said, thank you for your time and knowledge
You're welcome.
on our topic today.
Mm-hmm.